The single cardboard box felt heavier than it should have. Not from what it contained, just a few cherished photographs, a coffee mug his late wife had given him on their 30th anniversary, and a small clock that had sat on his desk for decades. No, the weight came from what the box represented. Everything that remained of Marshall Crane's 72 years of life. Standing outside the rundown apartment complex, Marshall hesitated before climbing the cracked concrete steps. The faded 7 on the door of Unit 12B hung upside down, an unintentional metaphor for his upended life. A cool autumn breeze rustled through, carrying the scent of someone else's dinner cooking nearby. His dinner would be a sandwich from the gas station down the street. Again. 3 months ago, he'd owned a comfortable 3-bedroom home 15 miles away. He'd had savings that would have lasted his lifetime. He'd had dignity, security, and a plan. Now he had a box and a key to an apartment smaller than his former garage. "Need help with that, sir?" A young man passing by gestured toward the box. "No," Marshall said, his voice sharper than intended. Then softening. "Thank you. I've got it." Pride. The one thing he couldn't afford to lose, yet the only thing he had left in abundance. The inside of the apartment wasn't much better than the exterior suggested. The carpet was worn thin in a path from the door to the kitchenette. The walls were an indeterminate beige that had absorbed decades of other people's lives. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner that couldn't quite mask the lingering cigarette smoke from previous tenants. Marshall set the box down on the fold-out table that came with the unit. He hadn't needed to bring furniture. The place came partially furnished, which meant a sagging couch, a wobbly table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed frame with a mattress he didn't want to think too much about. He'd bought new sheets at least. That had been his one indulgence. He sank onto one of the chairs and stared at the blank wall across from him. How had it come to this? The question had looped through his mind for months now, though he knew the answer perfectly well. A lifetime of careful decisions undone by a single moment of misplaced trust. It started, as these things often do, with trust and love. 2 years earlier, life had been good. Not extravagant, but comfortable and secure. Marshall had retired at 68 after 43 years operating machinery at the local manufacturing plant. His pension wasn't enormous, but combined with Social Security and the modest nest egg he and his late wife Carol had built, he had enough. The house was paid off. He had health insurance through his former employer's retirement plan. He volunteered at the community garden on Thursdays. He played cards with friends from the plant on Tuesdays. It wasn't the retirement some dreamed about. No beachfront condos or luxury cruises. But it was peaceful. It was his. He'd earned it. Then came the dinner that changed everything. "Marshall, you're practically family," his son-in-law Keith had said, refilling Marshall's wine glass. "That's why I wanted to talk to you first, before opening this up to other investors." Keith had married Marshall's daughter, Rebecca, 15 years ago. He worked in finance, something Marshall never fully understood beyond he helps people with money. Keith drove a new car every 2 years, wore tailored suits, and had a way of making complex financial matters sound simple and inevitable. "The returns are exceptional," Keith continued, showing Marshall projections on his tablet. 15, even 20% annually. Your money just sitting in that savings account? It's actually losing value with inflation. Marshall sipped his wine, feeling a mix of caution and curiosity. Sounds too good to be true. For an outside investor, maybe. But I'm bringing this to you as family. Low buy-in, ground floor opportunity. This development is going to transform the West Side. They're breaking ground next month. Rebecca squeezed Marshall's hand. "Dad, Keith's been so successful with his other clients. We just want you to benefit too." That was the thing about Keith. He always knew how to make you feel like he was doing you a favor. Looking back, Marshall would recognize all the red flags, the pressure of family expectations, the promise of returns too high to be realistic, the rushed timeline. But in the moment, sitting at his daughter's beautiful dining table, feeling included in something exciting and forward-looking, he saw only opportunity. "I'd need to think about it," he'd said. "Of course," Keith nodded, but his smile tightened just slightly. "But they're finalizing investors by the end of the month. I had to pull strings just to hold a spot for you." A week later, Marshall transferred $370,000, nearly his entire life savings outside of his pension, to the account Keith provided. The remaining $30,000 he kept in his savings account, just to be safe. Keith had called that unnecessarily cautious, but Marshall insisted. For 6 months, everything seemed fine. Marshall received monthly statements showing promising growth. Keith invited him to a groundbreaking ceremony where men in suits and hard hats pushed ceremonial shovels into dirt while photographers captured the moment. Marshall felt sophisticated, forward-thinking. Then the monthly statements stopped coming. "Just a system update," Keith explained over the phone. "Nothing to worry about." 2 weeks later, Rebecca called, sobbing. Keith had left. Their joint accounts were empty. The police were involved. It wasn't just Marshall. There were dozens of victims, friends, family, Keith's clients. There was no West Side development. The groundbreaking had been staged, the statements fabricated, and Keith was gone. The pension kept Marshall afloat at first. The house was paid off at least. But then came the second blow. The manufacturer that had employed him for nearly half a century filed for bankruptcy. The pension fund had been mismanaged for years. His monthly payments were cut by 60% and could disappear entirely, they warned. At 72, Marshall faced a reality he never imagined: financial ruin. Pride kept him from telling Rebecca how bad things had gotten. She was dealing with her own devastation. The betrayal, the divorce proceedings, the shame of being married to a man who had defrauded so many people. She'd moved back to her hometown 3 states away, taking Marshall's 2 grandchildren with her. "I just need a fresh start, Dad," she'd explained. "Too many memories here." He understood, but it meant facing his collapse alone. For 6 months, he tried to hold on. He cut every expense he could. Cancelled cable, turned the thermostat down to 62 in winter, ate simple meals of beans and rice, applied for every assistance program available, swallowing his pride with each form he filled out. But math is unforgiving. The property taxes alone were more than he could manage on his reduced income. The house, the home he'd shared with Carol, where they'd raised Rebecca, where he'd planned to live out his days, had to go. The real estate market was down. After paying off a small remaining mortgage and settling some medical bills Carol had left behind, Marshall walked away with barely enough for first and last month's rent on the cheapest apartment he could find. And now here he was, 72 years old, starting over with a box of memories and not much else. The first week in the apartment, Marshall barely left except to buy essentials. Shame kept him indoors, staring at the walls or the small TV he'd brought from the house. What would his former colleagues think if they saw where he lived now? What would Carol have thought of how he'd handled their life savings? Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by anxiety about the future. How long could he survive like this? His Social Security payments covered rent and utilities, with almost nothing left over. The $30,000 he'd kept back from Keith's scheme was now down to less than $5,000 after bridging the gap during the months he'd tried to save the house. At this rate, he'd be completely broke within a year. And then what? On the 8th day, Marshall woke to the sound of someone knocking on his door. For a brief, disoriented moment, he thought he was back in his old house. Reality settled back heavily. as he registered the thin mattress beneath him, the unfamiliar shadows on the ceiling. The knocking continued. Marshall pulled on his robe and shuffled to the door. A woman about his age stood in the hallway, holding a plate covered with aluminum foil. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I'm Doris Whitaker, 14A. I bring something to all the new residents. It's a tradition I started when I moved in 5 years ago." She held out the plate. Marshall took it automatically, confused by this unexpected interaction. "Thank you," he managed. "Banana bread," she explained. "My mother's recipe. I add walnuts, but I can make it without next time if you're allergic." Marshall couldn't remember the last time someone had baked anything for him. After Carol died, there had been a procession of casseroles and pies from neighbors and church members, but that was years ago. "I'm not allergic," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker." "Doris, please. And you are?" "Marshall. Marshall Crane." "Well, Marshall Crane, there's a group of us that plays cards in the community room on Tuesday nights. Nothing fancy, just nickel and dime stakes. You'd be welcome to join us." The invitation stirred something in Marshall, a faint memory of who he used to be, the man who played cards with friends every week, who had a place in a community. "I'll think about it," he said. Doris nodded. "No pressure. The bread doesn't come with strings." She smiled and headed back down the hallway. Marshall closed the door and uncovered the plate. The banana bread was still warm, releasing a homey aroma that seemed completely out of place in his stark apartment. He cut a slice and took a bite. It was good, moist and sweet with plenty of walnuts. For the first time in months, Marshall felt a tiny crack in the wall of isolation he'd built around himself. He didn't go to the card game that Tuesday, or the next. But he did start leaving his apartment more often. He found the public library 6 blocks away and discovered they allowed visitors to read newspapers for free. It became his morning ritual, a walk to the library, 2 hours with the papers, then a walk back. The exercise felt good, purposeful. The third Tuesday after Doris's visit, Marshall found himself standing outside the community room, listening to the murmur of conversation and occasional laughter from within. Before he could talk himself out of it, he opened the door. 5 people sat around a circular table, cards in hand. Doris looked up and broke into a smile. "Marshall, you decided to join us. Everyone, this is Marshall Crane from 12B. There were nods and hellos from around the table. An empty chair waited, as if they'd been expecting him all along. "We're playing 5-card draw," said a man with a neatly trimmed white beard. "I'm Walter, by the way. 8A. "I know the game," Marshall said, taking the seat. "Used to play every week." "Well then," Walter slid a stack of chips toward him. "Consider these alone till you get your sea legs back." For 3 hours, Marshall played cards, made small talk, and felt normal again. These people didn't know about his fall from financial security. They didn't see him as a victim or a fool. They just saw another retiree in the building, someone to round out their card game. When he returned to his apartment that night, it didn't seem quite as bleak. 2 days later, Marshall was at the library when he overheard a conversation between a librarian and her colleague. "We're still short-staffed for the evening shifts," the older woman was saying. "If we can't find someone, we'll have to cut back our hours." Before he could second-guess himself, Marshall approached the desk. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you looking for help? I used to be a machine operator, but I'm good with my hands, and I learn quickly." The librarian, her name tag read Patricia, looked surprised, but not dismissive. "It's only part-time," she said. 15 hours a week, just above minimum wage." "That would suit me fine," Marshall replied, standing a little straighter than he had in months. Patricia explained they needed someone to shelve books, help patrons with the copy machines, and close up 3 nights a week. The job didn't require specialized skills beyond basic computer literacy, which Marshall had. A week later, after a background check and a brief training session, Marshall Crane became the newest employee of the Oakwood Branch Library. At 72, when most of his peers were well into retirement, he was punching a time clock again. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd worked his entire life to earn his retirement, only to end up working again. But surprisingly, he didn't mind. The job gave him structure, a reason to get up and dress properly, and most importantly, a small but steady income to supplement his social security. The work itself was physically demanding in its own way. Books were heavy, and being on his feet for 5-hour shifts made his knees ache. But there was a satisfaction in the orderliness of it all. Each book had its place according to the Dewey Decimal System. Marshall found comfort in the logic of it, the predictability. He also discovered he enjoyed the interaction with library patrons. Children would ask him for help finding books about dinosaurs or space. Teenagers would whisper requests for research materials. Elderly patrons often just wanted someone to recommend a good mystery novel. "You have a knack for this," Patricia told him after he'd been there a month. "The patrons ask for you by name now." Marshall hadn't expected to find new purpose at this stage of life. He'd assumed his working years were behind him, that his only remaining identity was that of a retiree. But here he was, developing new skills, forming new relationships. His bank account was slowly stabilizing too. The library job didn't pay much, but combined with his reduced social security and careful budgeting, he was no longer drawing down his remaining savings. Some weeks, he even managed to put a few dollars aside. 6 months into his new life, Marshall had established routines that brought structure and small pleasures. Mornings, reading at the library before his shift. Tuesday night card games. Sunday walks in the park where he'd started volunteering with a community group that maintained the gardens. The apartment no longer felt like a symbol of his failure. He'd hung a few pictures, placed a small bookshelf by the window, added a comfortable reading chair found at a thrift store. It wasn't the home he'd shared with Carol, but it was becoming his home nonetheless. One evening, after finishing his shift at the library, Marshall ran into Walter from the card group outside the building. "Marshall," Walter called, "join me for a coffee? I want to pick your brain about something." They settled at a small cafe around the corner. Marshall ordered a regular coffee, one of his few indulgences now, while Walter got something complicated with whipped cream and caramel. "So," Walter began, "I noticed you're good with those machines at the library, the copiers, the scanners. I'm on the resident council for the building, and we've been talking about offering some basic technology workshops for residents. Nothing fancy, just helping people learn to use smartphones, set up email, that sort of thing. Would you be interested in helping?" Marshall almost laughed. "Me? I'm hardly a technology expert. But you're patient, and you explain things clearly. I've seen you at the library." Walter leaned forward. "Look, there are people in our building who can't FaceTime with their grandkids because they don't know how. Some can't even order prescriptions online. A little knowledge goes a long way." Marshall considered it. His own technology skills were basic but functional. He could navigate email, use search engines, even order groceries online when the weather was too bad to walk to the store. "I could try," he said finally, "but I'd need someone else who knows more than I do." "Already thought of that." Walter grinned. "Doris's granddaughter is a computer science major at the community college. She's willing to lead the sessions if we can find someone, closer to the participants' age who can help translate." And so, the Silver Surfers Technology Group was born. Every Thursday evening, Marshall co-taught basic computer and smartphone skills to residents of the apartment complex. The first session drew only 3 participants, but word spread quickly. By the 3rd week, they had to move to the larger community room to accommodate 15 eager learners. Working with Abby, Doris's 20-year-old granddaughter, gave Marshall insight into a generation he'd had limited contact with. She was whip-smart and kind, if occasionally impatient with concepts that seemed obvious to her, but baffling to their students. "No, Mrs. Chen, you don't need to say, 'Hey Google' after every word," Abby would explain. "Just at the beginning of your question." Marshall would then step in. "Think of it like getting someone's attention at a crowded table, May. You say their name first so they know you're talking to them, then you ask your question." These moments of bridging the gap between technical knowledge and practical understanding became Marshall's specialty. The gratitude from their students when they successfully made their first video call or ordered prescriptions online was reward enough, but Abby insisted they should charge a small fee for the classes. "Your time is valuable," she argued. $5 per person per session is more than fair." Marshall initially resisted, but realized the extra income, modest as it was, could help rebuild his emergency fund. The few $100s he'd started setting aside had grown, but was nowhere near enough to provide real security. As the Silver Surfers group expanded, so did Marshall's social circle. He was no longer just the new guy in 12B, but a person with skills to share, with value to offer. People greeted him by name in the hallways. They asked when the next class would cover online banking or photo sharing. Not every day was a victory. Marshall still had moments when the weight of his losses crushed down on him, when the gap between what his life had been and what it had become seemed unbridgeable. The first holiday season in the apartment was particularly difficult. Rebecca called to invite him to visit for Christmas, but Marshall declined, claiming he couldn't get time off from the library. The truth was, he couldn't afford the bus ticket, and he couldn't bear for his daughter and grandchildren to see how he was living now. Instead, he worked a double shift on Christmas Eve, covering for a colleague with young children, and spent Christmas Day alone with a frozen dinner and memories. His lowest point came in February, just past his 73rd birthday. The heating in the building malfunctioned during a cold snap. For 3 days, residents huddled under blankets as maintenance struggled to fix the ancient boiler. Marshall caught a bad cold that developed into bronchitis, keeping him out of work for 2 weeks. Without sick leave benefits, the missed shifts meant a significantly reduced paycheck. For the first time since starting his new life, he had to withdraw money from his small emergency fund to cover basic expenses. Lying in his cold apartment, struggling to breathe, feeling the meager security he'd built slipping away again, Marshall wondered if it was worth continuing the fight. What was he working toward? Even if he managed to stay afloat financially, what kind of future could he hope for at his age? A soft knock at his door roused him from these dark thoughts. It was Doris, bearing chicken soup and concern. "Walter told me you were ill," she said, brushing past him into the apartment. "Good heavens, it's freezing in here. Where are your extra blankets?" Before Marshall could answer, she was opening his closet, pulling out the one spare blanket he owned and tucking it around him on the couch. "I'm fine," he protested weakly. "Just need rest." "You need proper care," she countered, feeling his forehead with the back of her hand. "You're running a fever. Have you seen a doctor?" The truth was, he hadn't. His Medicare covered visits, but the co-pays and prescription costs were expenses he'd been hoping to avoid. Doris must have read the answer in his face. "Marshall Crane, you stubborn man. Wait here." She returned 30 minutes later with Walter and Dr. Reynolds from 9C, a retired physician who still kept his medical bag for emergencies. "This isn't necessary," Marshall insisted, embarrassed by the attention and the state of his apartment. Dr. Reynolds ignored his protests and performed a thorough examination, concluding that Marshall had a serious case of bronchitis that was verging on pneumonia. "You need antibiotics," he said firmly, writing a prescription. "And rest." Lots of fluids, and heat for heaven's sake. Walter was already setting up a space heater he'd brought from his own apartment. This should help until they fix the boiler. We'll take turns checking on you. Marshall felt tears threatening, not from pain or fever, but from the unexpected kindness. These people barely knew him. 6 months ago, they had been strangers. Now they were caring for him as if he mattered. "I don't want to be a burden," he managed. Doris snorted. "Oh, please. Last month when my sink was leaking, who came up with that clever fix using parts from the hardware store? And Walter, remember when Marshall helped you move that heavy bookcase? That's what neighbors do. We look out for each other." The small group left him with the space heater, medication — Walter had gone to fill the prescription — soup, and a schedule of who would check on him when. As the door closed behind them, Marshall felt something shift inside him. A recognition that while he had lost his financial security, he had gained something perhaps more valuable: a community. During his recovery, Marshall had time to reflect. He'd spent his entire working life focused on financial security, on building a nest egg that would see him through retirement. That security had proven more fragile than he ever imagined. But this new form of security, people who cared whether he was warm enough, whether he had eaten, seemed somehow more durable. By spring, Marshall was fully recovered and back to his routines. His emergency fund was slowly rebuilding. The Silver Surfers classes had expanded to include basic online safety and financial literacy, the latter a topic Marshall had painful expertise in now. "Always ask questions," he would tell their students. "If someone makes you feel rushed or says an opportunity is time-limited, that's a red flag. Legitimate investments don't work that way." He spoke from experience, but never shared the full extent of his losses. Some things were still too painful, too shameful to discuss openly. Then came the phone call from Rebecca. "Dad," she said, her voice tight with emotion. They found Keith. Keith had been arrested in Mexico, living under an assumed name. The authorities had seized assets, but most of the money was gone, spent on a lavish lifestyle or hidden in accounts they couldn't trace. "There will be a trial," Rebecca continued. "They want victims to testify." The prospect of facing Keith in court, of publicly admitting how thoroughly he'd been deceived, made Marshall's stomach churn. But there was also a small, fierce desire for justice, not just for himself, but for all the others Keith had betrayed. "I'll testify," he said. The trial was scheduled for late summer. In the months leading up to it, Marshall prepared himself mentally for the ordeal. He gathered documents, wrote down his recollections of conversations with Keith, the promises made. Doris and Walter noticed his preoccupation. One evening after cards, Doris followed him into the hallway. "Something's bothering you," she said. "You've been distracted for weeks." Marshall hesitated. He'd kept the details of his financial downfall private, sharing only that he'd had investments go bad when asked how he'd ended up at the apartment complex. But Doris's concerned expression broke through his reserve. Standing in the dingy hallway, Marshall told her everything: the trust he'd placed in Keith, the loss of his savings, the reduction of his pension, the shame that had kept him isolated for so long. Doris listened without interruption. When he finished, she took his hand in hers. "Marshall, do you think you're the only one here with regrets, with mistakes? Look around you. Every one of us in this building has a story of how we ended up here. Some better than others, but none perfect." She squeezed his hand. "The difference is whether we let those stories define us going forward." Her words stayed with Marshall as he prepared for the trial. When the day finally came, he entered the courthouse with Rebecca beside him, her support a balm to his nerves. Keith looked smaller than Marshall remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. When their eyes met across the courtroom, Keith quickly looked away. When Marshall took the stand, he spoke clearly about what had happened. Not just the financial details, but the human cost. The trust betrayed, the security destroyed, the relationships damaged. He knew exactly what he was taking from me, Marshall testified. Not just money, but my future. The life I'd worked 4 decades to secure. Keith was sentenced to 12 years. The verdict brought no financial restitution, that money was gone forever, but it did bring a sense of closure. Keith would face consequences for his actions. The other victims, many of whom Marshall met during the trial, would no longer wonder if he was living in luxury on their losses. As they left the courthouse, Rebecca hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she whispered. "So many people wouldn't have had the courage to start over the way you have." Marshall was surprised by her words. He hadn't thought of his actions as courageous, just necessary. What choice did he have but to keep going? But looking back over the past year, he could see it differently. Each step, taking the library job at 72, teaching technology classes, building new friendships, testifying in court, had required a kind of courage. Not the dramatic bravery celebrated in movies, but the quiet determination to face each day, to rebuild piece by piece. 1 year and 3 months after moving into apartment 12B, Marshall received an unexpected offer. Patricia, the head librarian, called him into her office. "Our children's librarian is retiring," she said. "We're reorganizing some positions, and I'd like to offer you more hours, 30 a week, with benefits. You'd still be doing some shelving, but also helping with children's story time, assisting patrons with research questions, that sort of thing." The increase in hours would nearly double his income from the library. With benefits, including health insurance to supplement Medicare, his financial situation would stabilize significantly. "I'm not a librarian," Marshall pointed out. "I don't have the degree." Patricia waved this away. "You have life experience and people skills. The kids love you. The seniors trust you. You learn quickly. We can teach you the technical aspects." That evening, Marshall shared the news with his friends at the card game. They celebrated with store-bought cookies and heartfelt congratulations. "You're an inspiration," Walter told him, "taking on new challenges at our age." Marshall shook his head. "Not by choice, necessity." "Does it matter?" Doris asked. "The result is the same. You're showing that it's never too late to build something new." Walking home after the gathering, Marshall reflected on her words. It was true. He hadn't chosen this path. Given the option, he would have preferred his original retirement plan: the comfortable house, the secure savings, the predictable days. But the path he was on now had its own unexpected rewards: purpose, community, new skills and knowledge. Even on good days, a sense of pride in his resilience. His apartment still felt small compared to his former home, but it no longer felt like a symbol of failure. The worn carpet, the thin walls, the temperamental plumbing, these were just features of the place where he lived now, not indictments of his choices. And he wasn't alone. The friends he'd made here understood struggle in ways his former neighbors never could. They shared resources, supported each other, celebrated small victories. Their net worth might be modest, but their community's worth was immeasurable. 2 years to the day after Marshall stood outside apartment 12B with his single box of possessions, he hosted a small gathering in the community room. Nothing elaborate: coffee, tea, and banana bread baked from Doris's recipe. His daughter Rebecca was there with her children. She'd visited twice in the past year, and while she still expressed guilt over Keith's actions, their relationship was healing. Marshall had finally allowed himself to be a father who needed support sometimes, not just the provider he'd always been. "Grandpa, show them the trick you taught me with the tablet," his grandson Tyler called out, tugging at his sleeve. The boy had barely spoken to him during their first visit, but now there was pride in his voice as he introduced Marshall to Rebecca's new friend. "He knows everything about computers now," Tyler explained seriously. Rebecca caught Marshall's eye across the room, mouthing a silent, "Thank you." Later, as they helped clean up, she squeezed his hand. "Dad, I used to admire you for what you provided us, but now I admire you for who you are." Abby was there too, proudly announcing she'd been accepted to a 4-year university to complete her computer science degree. The Silver Surfers classes were now officially sponsored by the library, with Marshall as a paid instructor twice a month. Dr. Reynolds raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To Marshall, who reminds us all that beginnings happen at every age." Marshall felt a flush of embarrassment, but also profound gratitude. At 74, his life looked nothing like he'd planned. His financial security was modest at best. His home was rented, not owned. His work life continued when he'd expected leisure. Yet surveying the faces around him, friends who had become like family, colleagues who valued his contributions, family members who saw him with new respect, Marshall realized he was rich in ways that couldn't be measured in bank statements or property deeds. He still had moments of regret, still felt the sting of shame when he remembered how easily he'd been deceived. But those feelings no longer defined him. They were part of his story, not its conclusion. When everyone had gone and Marshall was cleaning up, Doris stayed behind to help. 2 years, she said, wrapping leftover bread in foil. "Quite a journey." Marshall nodded. "Not one I would have chosen." "Few of us end up exactly where we plan," she replied. "The question is what we build where we land." Outside, the early evening light cast long shadows across the parking lot. From this angle, the apartment building looked almost charming, its faded brick warm in the sunset glow. Marshall paused to take in the view. This place that had once represented his lowest point now felt like home. Not the home he'd expected in his 70s, but home nonetheless. The future remained uncertain in many ways. His financial situation was still precarious by conventional standards. At 74, health concerns loomed. There were no guarantees. But Marshall had learned that there never had been. The security he'd thought he had built over decades had proven more fragile than he ever imagined. The new foundation he was creating, built on community, purpose, and resilience, seemed paradoxically more solid. Tomorrow, he would go to work at the library, help patrons find books, read stories to children. In the evening, he might work on lesson plans for the next Silver Surfers class, or call Rebecca to check on the grandkids. Simple activities, small pleasures, a life rebuilt not from grand plans or financial windfalls, but from daily choices and connections. They had said he was too old to start over, too set in his ways, too late in life to build something new. Marshall Crane had proved them wrong. Financial takeaway. Trust is a gift, not a financial plan. Always protect your future first. When someone promises extraordinary returns, especially a family member or friend, verify independently before investing. No legitimate investment opportunity requires rushed decisions or secrecy. At any age, whether you're 27 or 72, your financial security deserves professional verification and proper documentation. Remember, true wealth includes community and purpose alongside financial security, but protecting your savings against fraud is the foundation that gives you choices when life takes unexpected turns. Have you, or someone you love, ever had to rebuild from scratch later in life? Share your story in the comments. Your experience could inspire someone who needs it most. And if you believe it's never too late for a second act, like this video and subscribe to Goldprint. We share real stories that prove life doesn't end at retirement. It just changes.